Well, greetings. Welcome back to our study of Esther. Today we are covering Esther Chapter 4. If you haven't read the chapter, I would ask you to maybe pause the video, read the chapter, come back to it. In Esther Chapter 4, we are kind of presented with the quintessential moment of the book. This is, if you ask most people to describe the book of Esther, this is what they think of. They think of this scene where Esther and Mordecai have a confrontation, and after a good bit of deliberation, Esther says to Mordecai, well, if I perish, I perish. And we see kind of the first glimpse of Esther being an independent, free-thinking person who takes charge of the situation. We see Esther really growing into a leadership capacity. And for most people, that's what we think of when we think of the book of Esther. But up until now, we've seen Esther kind of in a different light. So let's set the stage. Mordecai is coming to the king's gate in mourning. He is lamenting the decision by the king to exterminate the Jews. He is grieving for his people, and so he shows up in sackcloth and ashes. The idea of ashes being a symbol of death. This was an outward sign to people that you were as good as dead, because ashes are all that's left when something is burned. And the sackcloth is there. It's think burlap. It is there to remind the person of the pain and the suffering that they are going through on the inside. It's for that time when you somehow or another forget the suffering that you're going through. That burlap scratching your skin is going to be a reminder. We think of medieval monks who would wear hair shirts, a coarse wool that would scratch against their skin as a sign of lament for sin in this world. Kind of the similar theme. Mordecai is so distraught by the king's decree that he acts like he's as good as death. And he approaches the king's gate, but he cannot go into the palace. And the first thing that, when I hear this, when I think about this scene, the first thing I picture is, why? Why is it that the king remains so far from the grieving? Now, on some level, there is a theological justification. The Israelites did something similar in that you could not go into God's presence in some of these states because they were, it was seen as a reminder of sin and the consequences of sin. And when you go into God's presence, you are meant to remember the world without sin. And so, to some extent, we see that there is a justification for Mordecai not being allowed into the gates because he is in a state of grief and mourning. But at another level, especially considering the king who we've seen described and the character of the king, we understand that this king isn't trying to protect purity for any other reason than he doesn't want to see it. He wants to believe the lie that he is telling himself, that the world is perfect. He wants to eat, drink, and be merry, and doesn't want to consider the injustice done to the people around him. He doesn't want to think about the level of injustice in the world. Mordecai is a reminder of that injustice, and the king doesn't notice. And I think we see some of that in the first reaction of Esther, who wants to send him clothes and say, come here, talk. Because she's completely detached from the suffering of her people. She's just completely detached from the suffering of people around her. And so she thinks it's a simple matter that Mordecai is slightly grieved over something. She doesn't understand the depth of the situation. And even in her kind of ivory palace, she thinks at first, or at least acts as though she thinks, that she's going to be safe. And it's a reminder to us that there are injustices all around the world. There's injustice that does not impact us. And we, as God's people, are meant to take that injustice seriously. We are to keep an eye out for the Mordecais of this world. And we are meant to protect them and help them. Because after all, that is what Esther does in this passage. She looks at the suffering, she looks at the injustice, and she works out a plan to help. And it's a reminder to us that that is our goal. And I don't think that we in predominantly Western, middle-class, suburban areas are terribly confronted with true injustices in this world and how they play out. And Esther is a reminder to us to be a little more aware of our surroundings and what the people around us are going through and how we can help them. But Mordecai gets this across to her. He gets across the injustice that he's suffering. He gets across to her the plight of her people. And Esther is now at a bind, because Mordecai also points out to her a very real fact. She's not safe in the king's palace. She is not safe where she is. She is in an environment where you have 30, 40, maybe 50 other women all wanting to be the king's favorite. And now somebody knows that Esther is related to Mordecai the Jew. Somebody knows that. People in the king's house know that secret. Now, in a few months, when Mordecai is killed because he's a Jew, don't you think somebody is going to look at the king and say, hey, that wife you got down there, one of many, many wives, who at this point in the story, while she was a favorite at one time, doesn't seem to be that important to him. One of many wives is also a Jew. How are you going to look if she escapes and the rest of them die? They're going to have her killed. And Mordecai knows that. Now Esther knows that. She suddenly realizes that her life is in danger because she can't be protected inside the walls of the palace. It was a cutthroat game, and she was on top for a while, but she was going to go down with the ship. She had to do something. This is one of those times where necessity seems to be the mother of invention, and it seems to force her to recognize who she is and her plight. That's a difficult thing for me and for many to grasp, that sometimes we just skate along until something very traumatic happens and we recognize the situation. And Esther, just like many of us, was not exactly thrilled about this. Her first reaction is, the king hasn't called me for a month. Now, I don't care how many women are in this harem. The fact that the king hasn't called for her in 30 days seems to hint that she is not a particular favorite. She might not be very low down the totem pole. She might be a mid-level wife, but she's not necessarily his go-to on every night. She has, in some way, lost her luster. Now, we can read into that any number of things. Many of them are bad about the king, and some of them might not reflect well on Esther. But what we are supposed to really focus in on is she's not in a position of favoritism. The king has forgotten her, which we can understand. The king brought her in because of his sexual appetite to get over a kind of nasty event, or, well, what he perceived as a nasty event. He brought her in to gratify his sexual appetite. Now he doesn't need her for that, so she's expendable. Esther suddenly wakes up to her position. Now, here's where we get into kind of the rub of the chapter and the force behind the whole book. Mordecai has finally convinced Esther of her precarious position. She is not a favorite. She is not somebody who is going to have a lot of influence just because of who she is. She's somebody who's liable to die in all of this. Now, what are you going to do? And after some convincing, she recognizes that it's on her. That, if God is there to protect the Jews, they will survive, but she might not. And it might be on her to protect them. It might be that she is in this position just for this day. And that you can see that kind of makes her feel a little small. She doesn't feel adequate to the task. She feels like, surely there has to be somebody better than me for this particular task. But she is going to do her part. She is going to at least try. And she asks Mordecai and the Jewish community to fast with her. Now, prayer is not explicitly mentioned in this book. God's not explicitly mentioned in this book. But fasting by itself, simply foregoing meals, is generally not what we see in the Bible. This would actually be the only instance of fasting being completely isolated from prayer. So what we should understand is that the people around Esther who have a vested interest in her community surviving, in her surviving, they're all going to fast and pray. They are going to look to God for answers in this situation. That's what they're going to do. That's what Mordecai is tasked with doing. That's what Esther has volunteered herself. We shouldn't necessarily read into it that it's a literal no food, no drink for 3 days. It might have been, but it doesn't have to be. The point is that they are going to go through no small feat of a time of prayer and dedication to understand what God wants from them. And at the end of that 3 days, Esther is going to trust that God will help her in her task to save the Jews. And I think that this should speak volumes to us, because so often we feel inadequate for the situations around us. We feel inadequate when we run up against the injustices of life, when we run up against the suffering of others. We feel inadequate to handle those situations, whether it's something major and maybe potentially touching the whole of society, or whether it's just helping somebody that we know and love work through a time of grief. We feel inadequate. We don't feel like we are up to that challenge. And what is Esther telling us? That's okay. You might not feel up to that challenge, but spend a significant amount of time with God. I have this feeling that if I was in a similar situation, my prayer would not be, God, reveal to me your will, so much as, God, here is my plan. Now help me to adjust it accordingly. Help me to see where it's going to fail. Help me to see where I'm going to fall down if I rely on this. And help me to instead turn everything over to your strength. And if I was in Esther's situation, these are the words that I am going to say to this king. If they are not your words, help me to change them. And for 3 days she prayed something similar to this, trying to understand what God wanted from her. And not just her, her entire community. Suffering brought them together. The injustice brought them together in a way that we don't see very often in our communities. We see, oh, this group's hurting. Well, that's too bad for them. But we don't enter into their hurt. We don't enter into the suffering. What Esther was calling for was Mordecai and all the people around him to say, here, even though our suffering is great, here's what Esther is going through. So for 3 days, we are going to join her in her suffering, in her anguish, in her dilemma. And at the end of that, they expected God to show up. They expected God's power to be there at the end of those days. And that is where we need to be. We need to be at a place where we expect God to show up every time we pray. We might have to commit to significant time of prayer, but we should expect God to show up and not just miraculously work, not just throw pieces together, but to honestly work through us. Sometimes that's going to be sloppy. Sometimes that's going to be not perfect, but it's going to be authentic, and it's going to help us grow into the likeness of God. And I think that's where Esther is, and where we leave it today is that Esther is growing. She is becoming more reliant on God, and thus better able to handle the problems that she faces in her world. And so I invite you again, keep reading with us. Join us again for chapter 5. Have a blessed day.